Welcome to BYJU'S classes. This week we bring to you a very special edition of the Weekly Review of International Affairs. As we know, the United Nations, the most significant international organization in international relations and world politics, is celebrating its 75th birth anniversary this year. And every year in the month of September, there is a very special session of the United Nations General Assembly which takes precedence over all else for most member states in their international relations. Now, as we know, the United Nations has two important organs. One is the Security Council with 5 permanent members with veto powers, 15 members in all, including 10 elected temporary members, and the United Nations General Assembly, to which all the members belong. Most of the time, students of international relations keep concentrating on the Security Council, and the United Nations General Assembly is usually forgotten. But these are not the only two organs of the United Nations. There are other specialized agencies of the United Nations like WHO, institutions sponsored by it like WTO, World Trade Organization, UNESCO, FAO, etc. This year particularly, two things have been important. WHO, one of those specialized agencies, the World Health Organization, spawned by United Nations, has been in the center of a controversy about the outbreak of the corona pandemic with the virus escaping from the Wuhan lab, and its complicity, or at least its flexibility to Chinese interests to a degree, has been discussed to the extent where the American president said that he might stop funding this and walk out of it. That's one part. We shall discuss that later. But this year, for another reason, for the students of international relations appearing for competitive examinations, this session is of special significance because India has been elected for a 2-year term, a temporary member of the Security Council. Our term begins in January, and the whole world looks at how India will steer to the best of its ability the activities of this organ and the rest of the United Nations. And the third reason why this year's United Nations General Assembly session in September, which is going to be continuing for a few weeks, and last week everything revolved around it, is that because of the coronavirus epidemic, there is no physical session as far as the participants are concerned. Except very few people who are present at the headquarters, almost all the world leaders are making a virtual presentation, pre-recorded statement, and this is getting to be more of a bilateral interaction, focusing on things of global concern like the climate change, like the coronavirus pandemic, like the changing power equation between the great powers, including the permanent members of the Security Council. All this makes this session a very, very important session from the point of view of the aspirants appearing for the civil service examinations and all students of international relations. So where do we begin? First of all, there was a statement made by the Chinese President Xi, who appeared to be conciliatory, who kept talking about that how there are global challenges which the world must face together. We should not be acrimonious, we should not fight with each other, we should respect each other's internal affairs, sovereignty, etc. And it was an indirect appeal towards multilateral cooperation of discussing all international relations conflicts with consensus and diplomacy. But the response to it was pretty harsh as far as the West was concerned. The European Union political head, Michel, categorically said, and this came just in the aftermath of the Chinese President Xi's virtual tour of the European capitals and trying to say that, look, not everybody should follow in the footsteps of confrontationist Trump. They should not put all their eggs in one basket. They should try to diversify their interest and look for their independent interests vis-a-vis China. But this gentleman, the head of the political wing of the European Union, categorically said China should never mistake that it doesn't share the values on which we are organized. That means European Union, it meant the Western world, it meant the Atlantic fraternity and the partnership with America, and it says that he also categorically said these are the values which are democracy, which are human rights, and which are respect for international law. Now, the Chinese argument has always been that these are Western values imposed on countries which are not Western. If we examine this deeply, the Chinese argument has some substance, because the evolution of international law, evolution of international organization, the concept of human rights, the concept of Western-style democracy, all have evolved in the Western world. Now, but the point is that if the world is to coexist peacefully, there has to be an understanding about mutual differences in cultural, civilizational values, and still settle our differences without letting them become a dispute. The same thing happened a little while ago when the French president also said that China should not imagine that it can divide a wedge between us and our long-time traditional friends, allies, fraternal associates like the United States of America. China's effort had been in the past few weeks to create some kind of a difference between European Union and make them see that they have interests which are different other than US's strategic interests, and they should not blindly follow America about imposing sanctions on China, etc. The other interesting aspect which came out in this is that there are other conflicts besides China, besides America. Even the Russian President Putin came out with a statement which was constructive, supporting of United Nations, and he kept arguing that he praised United Nations and said this is an organization which has maintained peace, which has tried to reduce suffering in the world, which plays a constructive role in reconstruction and poverty alleviation in the most abjectly poor developing nations, to fight disease and so on. Now, this was partly probably necessary because Putin has been silently intervening in conflicts far away from Russian borders, from northwestern tip of Africa to the Middle East and to Iraq and Syria, and it probably is very happy that the United Nations has not passed any strictures against its interference in conflicts far removed from its own borders and territories. But while Putin makes a plea for strengthening of the UN, Xi makes a plea of consensus and cooperation in diplomacy, the European Union, Britain, France come out and say that, look, China must change. Unless China changes, there is no possibility of United Nations or any other forum providing a stage where the two sides can cooperate. And China has been put in the dock about human rights violations in Xinjiang with Uyghur Muslims, allegations of genocide of them, also the crushing brutally of the democratic movement in Hong Kong. Now, and also the China's expansionist drive in flagrant violation of the United Nations Convention on Laws of Seas. So this is one part of the UN General Assembly annual session in September, like every year this year, where we see whatever is happening in the globe elsewhere being reflected on this. But this is about the big actors: Russia, China, European Union, America, and so on. What about the minor actors whose fortunes are affected no less by what happens in the United Nations? So we had the Greek foreign minister addressing his counterpart in Turkey, and the two have been confronting each other in Eastern Mediterranean and say, let's give diplomacy a chance. Now, the Turkey hasn't responded constructively so far to this overture, but Turkey joined hands with Pakistan to castigate India about human rights violations in Kashmir, about the upsetting harmony between communities on the subcontinent. And this was totally uncalled for, kind of a raking up of bilateral issues in a forum which deals with multilateral cooperation and so on. The Indian Prime Minister, when his turn came, did not demean himself by addressing Pakistan or accusing Pakistan of something. He did not even name a country with which we are having a major border dispute, a military confrontation with China. He only referred that no country should take any unilateral step which becomes a threat to world peace. And he also reviewed India's role in various peace missions, peacekeeping missions of United Nations, said that how much we have contributed, how much we have sacrificed, and he kept talking of the whole world being a family. The phrase he used was Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, and this was a separate thing. But he did mention rather strongly that when a country like India draws close to another country, presumably America, it is not against yet another country like China. So friendship with one country doesn't mean enmity with other. So all these things will take some time before they sink in. We know what their impact on international relations is. Another speech at the United Nations General Assembly, which turned heads and people listened to it attentively, was the one made by Sheikh Hasina of Bangladesh. She made a very impassioned plea addressing on a special issue of climate change the UN General Assembly, and she said, "My country has suffered much because of climate change. Very recently, 1/3 of our land was covered by water which was flooding, inundating our land. We have suffered much due to cyclones. We have suffered much due to the level of the water being raised." She reminded that the world has no hope unless it controls the carbon emissions and reduces the temperature to at least 1.5 degrees of the one target fixed at the Paris summits and otherwise. And we have seen, she reminded people, that manifestations of this not only in Bangladesh but also in the United States of America, the fires in California, the fires in Amazon region, the fires in Australia. What she laid emphasis on, she says that I belong to a nation which is one of the most vulnerable nations. And she mentioned that among the members of the United Nations, there are 43 such members. And she is the spokesperson for all of them. But what she said, very interestingly, was that I'm not making an appeal for help. I'm here to share a warning with you that we must work together to cope with this climate change. Otherwise, we sink together. There is no hope for us. And everything which we are facing, whether it is coronavirus pandemic or a political strife or resettlement of refugees or internally displaced person, is related somewhere or the other. A food shortage, malnutrition, disease, economy is sluggish, is related to what is happening in the larger, broader context of climate change. I think this is an issue which the Indian Prime Minister also referred to in his speech, and the Americans are more willing, after their recent experience of cyclones and flooding and forest fires, that they too are not like the virus, immune to these things which are either a virus or a forest fire or a climate change. We have in past talked in this program about the ice cap Arctic. We have talked in terms of climate change and its havoc it is wreaking in Antarctica. We have talked of droughts and floods in African continent. So I think Sheikh Hasina did a great service to humanity by reminding that this forum, which is there, allows the smaller, voiceless nations to come out with this. On one hand, the leaders of China were addressing the United Nations General Assembly, reassuring them of its commitment to international organization, norms of international law, diplomatic conduct, behavior, and so on. And on the other, the Chinese actions in different parts of the world was creating grave apprehensions that it continues to follow expansionist, almost aggressive drives into territories where it has no business to be. One example of this was Chinese fishing fleet, which is referred to often as a dark fleet of China, was caught fishing in waters very close to Peru on the northern tip of South American continent, thousands of kilometers away from Chinese territory across the Pacific Ocean. Now the Chinese continue to claim that their fishing fleet was only fishing in international waters, while the Peruvian side feels threatened and says, stop the Chinese, and the Chinese often intrude into their exclusive economic zone, at times also into their territorial waters. Even if one concedes the Chinese claim for argument's sake, there are interesting and serious questions that emerge. The Chinese have been accused of trawling the seabed and overexploiting the seabed resources of fisheries. This affects the spawning of the fish, breeding of the next generation, and also depleting the fish for the other nations which depend on this fishery trade and business very close to their waters. So on one hand, China having more sophisticated trawlers, and also what causes suspicion is that they switch off their GPS, they switch off radio communications, they have flags of convenience, they keep changing their names, and they come in a big fleet together. And people say that first the Chinese come with fishing fleets, and then comes their naval fleets, and the fishing fleets pave the way for naval intervention and exerting their power in these territories. The Chinese have been accused of doing the same in South China Sea. As far as the Chinese are concerned, they say, why blame us? Of course, why they blame is for a different reason. They are allegedly fishing 15% of the total fishery resources, even on international waters, and often encroaching into territorial waters or exclusive economic zone of other countries. But the Chinese say that why not look at United States? They do the same. Other countries do the same. So this fishery is also an interesting issue, of disputed issue between United Kingdom and the European Union, one unresolved issue which continues. So I think what we should keep in mind is this: there is an environmental dimension related to this, there is a territorial dispute dimension related to it, there also is a certain pattern in Chinese fishing fleets coming out and then preparing the way for its naval power exertion. So people have to be concerned about this. Not only people in Peru, the economic sanctions imposed on a country like Venezuela, and again anonymous ships which can't be traced directly to China have broken the taboo, broken the sanction, taken the oil, and mid-water refueling in mid-ocean has taken place, and it has been taken to destinations as far away as maybe either China or Iran. So there are issues involved, continued pattern of aggression, expansionist drive, and no change in its behavior regardless of what it says openly. So there was a Deng Xiaoping saying that bide your time, hide your power. China doesn't seem to be worried about this anymore. At times, the viewers of this program might get the feeling that some small incident which we are covering as a part of our weekly review is not important for them. We would like to emphasize and remind them that no development, however small, insignificant, or relating to a small country can be dismissed by an aspirant of a competitive examination. If you are preparing for the IAS, preparing for the IFS, IPS, or whatever it is, you must keep in mind that any one of these small sparks can ignite a large conflagration which can in a blink become a major international crisis. And there are small events happening in countries which are normally not in the headlines, which in the past week have again reminded us of this dictum, the truth of this dictum, that countries can have small snowballing of a disturbance, a dispute, an agitation, a movement, a protest, which suddenly becomes a flashpoint. One such case is Belarus in the Eastern Europe, on the periphery of Russia, where Lukashenko rigged the elections, claimed a victory in presidential election, claiming more than 85% votes. There was protests against him and the elections in the main street in Minsk and in the small towns where factories were involved. And this man, this Stalinist leader who had ruled this communist country with an iron fist for almost 3 decades, 27, 28 years, suddenly found himself isolated. He was referred to as a rat. People said, go out, go out. And interestingly, the protest movement against him was led by women, especially a lady called Svetlana, whose husband had not been allowed to contest in presidential elections. She now is living in exile, fearing for her life and her children, but her spirit remains unbroken, and she keeps addressing her country people, her compatriots, that don't give up the fight, please continue doing so. Now, this has been almost the regular pattern for 8-9 weeks, where hundreds of thousands of people assemble on the streets of the capital Minsk. They assemble in larger numbers in other towns, small and big, in factory towns. And when the president goes to address his loyal communist workers, he is booed. He dare not appear in public. He also has sworn into his office in great secrecy without much media publicity. He has for the moment succeeded in crushing using brutal water cannons, rubber pellets, etc., tear gas demonstrations, but they don't stop. They seem to be regenerating, and the presence of women and young girls makes it very difficult for the security people to be more brutal. They are reasonably brutal, but they can't go beyond a certain limit. And the women are very courageous. They tear off the masks of the face, the balaclava caps which these soldiers are wearing, to expose that these might not even be policemen or members of regular security services. They might be just hooligans who are being employed by the president who's no longer in their eyes a president, to crush the rebellion. Now, Lukashenko's greatest hope was to get support from Putin. Putin made these noises that it would see to it that Belarus doesn't fall into the lap of the Western powers, not into the NATO allies. Nobody should be able to destabilize a country which has been a loyal ally of Russia. But Putin has not so far done something concrete besides stating that he would give diplomatic support, moral support, and if need be, send some troops there to stabilize law and order situation. So far, Russia has not intervened directly, but there seems to be no sign of these protest movements for restoration of democracy or for free and fair elections take place. One interesting thing is that there seems to be a generational divide. There are some people, middle-aged, older, who conservative, pro-communist, who may still have a residual sympathy for Lukashenko, but not the majority of young people who have access to internet, who know what is happening in the world elsewhere, and who want to have freedom of expression. And all of them have a different set of demands. Some want constitutional reform, some want free and fair elections, some just want freedom to choose their professions, some don't want police operation. Now, interestingly, how Putin responds to this is important, because Putin is being accused of trying to get rid of his opponents by poisoning them, and also there is this case of Navalny, whose supporters have won a few seats, very few, but for the first time significant numbers in Siberian local elections. And how Putin manages Belarus, how other East European nations within the orbit of Russia react, how Putin himself, who's now quite an elder statesman, who has ruled without any challenge for almost more than 22-23 years in Russia, responds to his opposition in Russia is worth watching. Now, Belarus has been criticized by erstwhile allies of Soviet Union, Austria, Hungary, Poland. All of them have criticized Belarus, and European Union has threatened that it might impose sanctions against Belarus. Now, whether that would actually happen or not is besides the point. But what we have to keep in mind is that Belarus has been simmering for past 4 or 5 weeks. There are no signs of this protest movement dying down, either the protesters moving back or the president conceding. Putin seems to be taking his time to decide what he intends to do, and this problem is likely to be an issue which might blow out of proportion in near future. It has something to do with the future of opposition dissent in Russia, in Eastern Europe, and about democratic movements and aspiration of young people elsewhere. There was another movement of democratic young people in Hong Kong, which China could brutally suppress, and for the moment seems to have gotten the better hand of. But go to the other almost end of the continent, not from Europe, we go to Southeast Asia, and in Thailand the pattern is the same. Normally people don't think of Thailand other than a very pleasant tourist destination where they can go and have a very happy time on the beach, eat great kind of food, have an inexpensive sightseeing trip and come back. But there again, for the past 4 or 5 weeks, the students have been staging protests and gradually raising the ante of their demands. They want the Prime Minister, who earlier used to be a general in the army, to resign. He is the one who had got a constitution drafted and imposed. They want the constitution to be changed drastically, altered and amended. And what is most risky is that in Thailand, there are very strict rules for criticizing the king or the monarchy or the institution of the monarchy. But this time, the young students have taken the risk. They have questioned why the king is away from the country when the country is reeling under COVID. Why is so much money being spent on his upkeep? Why is he trying to assume powers, expropriate in his hands to become an absolute monarch, and no longer he's happy with constitutional monarchy? They also are questioning whether army is using him as a shield to do their unconstitutional, tyrannical, despotic acts in the name of the king and keep him happy by indulging in his life of pleasure and somewhere else from the country. This king unfortunately has not been half as popular as his father, who was really revered by people, but tactlessness of the present monarch, coronavirus, army not knowing what to do, and again, like Belarus, there is a generational gap. The protest movements 10 years back, 15 years back in Thailand used to be of a different kind. They were followers, they still are part of this protest movement partially, the red shirts, who were followers, Shintuara, the popular charismatic leader, who was not allowed to continue by the army, by another coup. But this time, the students who are from Thammasat University, other universities, young people who have been working, who have lost their livelihoods because of the coronavirus in tourism trade, in hospitality trade, they are all there. Now again, there might be a difference of opinion about the protesters, about what they want, but army certainly doesn't know what to do with these protesters. And these protesters flash their mobile phones light, refuse to vacate the space, occupy the Royal Palace grounds, put a new plaque there which is removed by the army, they go back there again. So far the army has avoided brutal repression, and again, because of the internet, because of the social media, this movement is seen all over the world. There is no need to reach a hasty conclusion that this will lead to a drastic change in Thailand, but the problem is the same, that you cannot underestimate or write off the protest movements of students, youngsters in Thailand or Belarus. They are part of the same global angst, anguish, anger of the younger generation, that why should they not have the same freedoms which youngsters of their age have in Western democracy. And this is something, and they articulate, they want a green planet, they want a discussion about climate change, they want freedom of expression, democratic rights, and so on. So this is what I think the world has to live with. The world is interconnected. The world has been globalized. Now suddenly the United States might decide to disengage, disentangle, decouple from China. But can it really be done by countries which already are so entangled in the process of globalization, have benefited with it, either have ties with China or with ties with America or ties with their immediate neighbors? Can you separate one country from the other so easily, which we'll have to worry about in near future? Something which has been a kind of a riddle or a puzzle in the events last week in international relations has been the conduct of the United States of America. So much has been happening, and why is it that the United States of America, the sole superpower, the hyperpower, is not in a position to make its presence felt on the international arena, either at the United Nations or anywhere else? I think the reason is not far to seek. The American president is busy engineering, securing his re-election, and he has succeeded partly into dividing America into two halves of those who support him vehemently and those who oppose him. And he is hoping that by the end of the day, when the nation goes to poll, he would have swung the balance in his favor. He keeps the nation confused whether he will vacate White House if he loses, or there will be a legal challenge. And what is complicated life is that senior most liberal judge in the US Supreme Court passed away, and this has provided with an opportunity to Trump to nominate a judge of his choice, a conservative judge who may be of great help and support to him in the post-election scenario if it is disputed. He is doing everything in his power to make it a disputed election, say that it is very long time counting, ultimately it should be referred to a court, there might be all kind of legal challenges. He never gives a straight answer. He has also by now announced a preference for a woman of conservative Roman Catholic temperament, a federal judge who's decidedly representing everything opposed to the judge who died. So she was a women's liberation person, a pro-abortionist, and this lady is a devout Roman Catholic. She thinks abortions are immoral. She believes that same-sex relationships are immoral, and this is what is creating additional tensions in America. So everybody, Biden as well as Trump, are trying to manage these things to their advantage, these debates which have little to do with international relations, but in long term are likely to have an impact on international relations elsewhere also. Not only a question of what happens in the Roman Catholic community in America, whether it's abortions, whether it is euthanasia, whether it is divorces, whether it is, because it cuts across the whole range of belief systems, scientific or religious. You either say it's a matter of faith or you say it's a matter of reason and science. So the anti-science Luddite proclamations in which Trump specializes are America should not have no stem cell research, America should not have this, America should not have that, and America should have a set of values which are basically Christian, Orthodox, and have no scope for liberal values. So it is not how America's relationship, no, all America is not Roman Catholic. The first Roman Catholic president was John Kennedy. But the point is that if it's Christians versus non-Christians, we go back in international relations to a clash of civilization between Islamic people, between the Cynic civilization and the Christian civilization, and the old crusades thousands of years, centuries ago, in the millennia past. Now also it has implications for scientific research. What kind of scientific research can be conducted, sanctioned by a nation which is God-fearing and devout, stem cell research, cloning, DNA research, genetic modifications, or American companies shift this research to a godless nation like China, with whom they don't have a particularly happy relationships at the moment, or Korea, or maybe have trials which they don't allow on their own citizen in a poor country like India. So this is something which is not only concerning America. So this is an important, interesting issue. Also the issue of race, which we shall discuss a little more. When the Black Lives Matters movement erupted, it was George Floyd's death. But the violence has not stopped. There is no week when a man of color is not killed, or in an angry protest against the killing of this person, a white person is not killed. As we talk to each other in this lecture series this week, the governor of Oregon has been forced to call state guards and order them that they can use harsh measures like tear gas, like rubber pellets, like water cannons to control violent mob who have threatened to come and assemble in support of Trump in Portland. Now, Portland City has been a scene of violent clashes between citizen and police. Police has been accused of racial prejudice. The black women continued to be killed, and the white policemen which charge into invading the privacy of a person of color, either in his car or the flat, are not even indicted, and a black person on mere suspicion is killed, humiliated, and all kinds of discrimination becomes public. So this again is going to be an election issue in America, but this is also going to trigger reactions elsewhere in the world, because how can the United States of America put China in the dock about Uyghurs and Muslims if its own conduct or violation of human rights of people of color in America is so tarnished? So this is what is keeping America preoccupied at the moment, is likely to keep America preoccupied till the elections take place, till the results come out, which means that the American capacity to play a decisive role in international relations in coming weeks is going to be shrinking, it's going to be limited. Last week's events in international relations exposed another interesting irony. While the West was trying to castigate China about human rights violations, fingers were being pointed at other violations of human rights elsewhere in the world also. The world suddenly noticed that the Europe itself was drifting dangerously towards racism and Islamophobia of a certain kind. The French President Macron had some time back made an announcement that France would not buckle down under any dogmatic terrorist creed, and it would not curtail its freedom of expression. If need be, it would reproduce the cartoons which had aroused the anger of the Islamic fanatics. And he referred in this context to Charlie Hebdo, which had been the magazine which was attacked by the Islamic terrorists. Only last week, two other television company employees when they were attacked by knife-wielding attackers, miscreants, and now it has come out that this was a Pakistani youth who had been Islamized, indoctrinated into fanatical Islamic terror. Now, nobody lost their life, but similar knife attacks have taken place in last week in England, where again they say, no, this is not, actually we don't think it is a terrorist, but there are interesting issues which make the story pretty suspicious. There was a youngster who was taken to the police station and he was handcuffed behind his back, and he managed to bring out a revolver and shoot the police officer dead, and then shot himself and is lying critically injured in a hospital. This almost reminds you of a fake encounter story which we hear many times in this country. Managed to snatch a gun from a custodian policeman and shot him dead and escaped. But in this case, he used his own gun, and he did not snatch a policeman's gun. And again, then you say, we are investigating all angles, but there may not be a terror angle here. There have been cases of provocative statements made by either the French president or the people who say that we shall not buckle down under threats of Islamic jihadi terrorists. We will continue to express our views. We'll continue to have satirical cartoons, even if they mock the fun of Prophet. So where does the limits of free speech in the West begin and end is an issue which the world has to cope with in coming times. So while on one hand, we blame all the time the fanatics of Islam and the terrorists who have no tolerance, at the same time, do we accept that any provocative, inflammatory speech on the grounds of freedom of speech should be tolerated? This applies as much to the Charlie Hebdo incident, as much as to Islamophobia in Sweden and Denmark, as much as to intolerance of President Trump and white supremacists in America. So this is something which is going to cause concern to the rest of the world. Now, this racism is not only between the whites and men of color, Islam versus Christianity. You see, there is a dimension of this in the relationship deteriorating between China and Australia. There have been recent incidents where the Chinese have claimed that Chinese citizens have been victims of cyber terrorism, cyber kidnapping in Australia, and a financial fraud has taken place over internet to dupe their parents of millions of dollars of money. Now, China itself has been accused of using cyber terrorism as a weapon, and a British senior officer, civil servant, has confessed, a general besides the civil servant, that Britain has a capacity for offensive cyber warfare. So this is interesting. If you have a social media which is not controlled by any national sovereign jurisdiction, how do you control hate speech? How do you control provocative statements or cartoons or publication in one country, not triggering off incidents of racial violence elsewhere? And this cycle, this vicious cycle of, it is already affecting Europe. The European Union has had to make certain compromises that if aid is to be given to refugees, etc., the numbers have to be restricted and the policies about accepting them is going to change. So this is something which is going to strike at the core values of human rights and refugee resettlement and democratic freedoms. They do not always coincide with each other. At times they seem to be appearing at cross purposes. The continent of Africa continues to remain in a state of distress. The country which seems to be in a state which is causing greatest concern is South Africa. Once supposed to be the hope for the whole continent, South Africa has long been listed as an industrialized nation, as a developed nation, as a rich nation, having a pretty high per capita income, very good GDP, etc. But now this bubble seems to have burst. Its economy has shrunk 51% during the period of Corona crisis. And can we still call it a developed country, an industrialized country, a rich country after its economy has shrunk to less than its half? What is even more distressing is that ever since the period of apartheid ended, the racial discrimination ended, Africa has never been fortunate enough to be ruled by good governance. Now, there has been a deepening divide between the extremely rich black ruling elite and the whites, descendants of the people who ruled in the heydays of apartheid, continue to be very, very rich and lead a very, very posh lifestyle. But the rest, the majority of the colored people, live a life of abject poverty. Now, there have been incidents in recent past because India has had a relationship with South Africa which is special because of the stay of Mahatma Gandhi there for a long number of years. He forged the weapon of satyagraha, civil disobedience, non-violence, non-cooperation there, that we think that India has a special bond with South Africa. But this bond, it seems, is almost fraying. In the recent crisis, after the economic crisis, there was rioting and looting of shops, and most of the owners of these shops were people from Indian subcontinent, people from India, people from Bangladesh. They were Hindus and Muslims, and they were non-Christians, and they were not either blacks or whites. So they were the targets of the anger of the impoverished people of South Africa, who thought that these were people who were denying them their legitimate share of employment or profit or whatever it is. People also remember that there have been Indians like the Gupta family who corrupted the South African government, and President Zuma had to ultimately resign. There also have been, unfortunately, the burdens of a tribal past where after Nelson Mandela, no leader has actually been charismatic enough to bring about reforms in education, root out corruption, get nepotism out. Not even Nelson Mandela succeeded entirely from the South African politics. So what happens is that there are superstitious beliefs about what can cure or not cure HIV/AIDS, what causes coronavirus, and this is likely to continue in coming years, like Brazil, where the myth of Brazil being a pillar of the third world tricontinental cooperation, South Africa seems to have been a country where the bubble has burst, where in Brazil it is the burning of the Amazon rainforest, the right-wing reactionary despotism tyranny of Bolsonaro. But in South Africa it is sheer misgovernance and sheer breakdown of administration which is heading towards anarchy, which might happen like the rest of the African continent. The multinationals might continue to profit, but the common man will suffer. And nobody can realistically expect South Africa to provide a lead to Zimbabwe, to Angola, to Mozambique, to Botswana, to Namibia. What world had once hoped that India could cooperate with it, China could cooperate with it, Russia could cooperate with it, and this would be a stable alternative structure of international cooperation organization countervailing the Western powers. So this is not likely to happen. Elsewhere in Africa also, violence continues unabated. Only last week there were 15 people killed in the northeastern province of Nigeria, 15 people killed in Ethiopia, 10-12 people killed in Somalia. The violence just doesn't seem to stop. In Sudan, Somalia, Libya, the civil war, people have given up all hopes of a truce. The dispute between Ethiopia and Egypt on the Grand Dam continues. The environmental devastation of droughts or floods continues. And nobody has any time to believe that how Africa under these circumstances can cope with, despite its rich store of mineral resources, or internecine tribal warfare, or the Islamic terror. So we have to, but we can't write off Africa under any circumstance. It is home to 55 countries. It is a big chunk of what you call the part of the old world. Historically, old ties with Asia and Europe. But then memories of colonialism, memories of racial discrimination, memories of looting, memories of mercenaries, primordial tribal feuding all continue, and any one of them can involve a big power, an external power, and lead to a crisis in international relations. And this is all we have for you this week. We shall try to address some of your concerns in coming installments, coming episodes of this program. We shall try to discuss some questions, a couple of questions perhaps every week, which you might consider of special significance. Some of you probably have not studied political science or history before, and you are absolutely new to the realm of international relations. So we shall also try to have a small section in this program which introduces the major countries, the major problems, gives you a historical background, so you don't feel out of your depth. Look forward to seeing you next week. Till then, goodbye.